ecosystem and the nature and care for nature, to just try and rip as much out of nature as you can, and sort of don't give a fuck about nature and the ecosystem. And that's the wrong way to look at it, because if you look at all the old, sort of tribal cultures, they all have very, very similar religious, sort of, not religious, but their belief structures are very similar in the fact that it's a lot about like the animals and the ecosystem and everything in their external physical environment, and sort of how you pay homage to that and how you worship that, which is, that's the right way to look at it, because that way, like, if we take those actions of focusing on making sure our ecosystem flourishes, by default we flourish as a result. It's far easier to hunt in a plentiful field than it is, with scarce resources. So why not take care of it? And you just think, like, the ecosystem back then, prior to Australia being colonised, housed a far greater colony than after. So the ecosystem was like in its optimal, like it was just performing at its full potential with a far greater amount of people, because there's many reports of how when the pioneers brought and the first settlers brought their cattle across and their sheep, how quickly it compacted the soil. Now, it's not that, agriculture is a bad thing, but it's that agriculture without any conscious thought for the land is the wrong way to be. So that's what the First Nation peoples had, was they had an approach where they conducted agriculture with the land in mind. And they were able to, live a very, very high sustained life. Like, so much of that history was lost, and that's the big shame. And that knowledge that, we don't really know how they lived, but prior to colonisation, it's said that it was a very, 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 highly nutritious diet. They had not much in the way of disease and things like that. And the cohesiveness in the societal structure that they had was very, like, it functioned at a higher rate. There was a lot of cohesiveness. Not to say that there wasn't, disputes and things like that, but, it was nothing to what it was after. Because you got to understand, like, in the West, we got colonized in the Roman times. So we lost. Because you look back to ancient times, you had ancient Rome, you had the Gaul, you had all these different sort of tribes and tribes within tribes, which was the exact same belief structures and ways of life as, the First Nations, as the not the African Americans, the Native Americans, as all of the indigenous, Canadian tribes and all of that, the Eskimos, like, it was all the same. So that's one thing that, I've realised personally throughout, experiencing and learning other cultures and exploring my own culture. Because, for example, like, my culture personally is Celtic, and Celtic comes from the south of France. They're the Gaul. So if you ever watch the ancient Roman movies, the Gaul were the barbarians. That's my tribe. The barbarians and the forest people. That's why I'm called to the trees. So, like, by taking away our culture, which they did, it disconnects us from who we truly are. And this is what the First Nations in Australia fought so hard for, and why their culture has been so decimated is because it's been sort of torn apart. And like, when you take away, and you can listen to this if you listen to many First Nations advocates that talk about like their culture and sort of getting it back to the youth. The youth are destroyed because they don't have a sense of identity. And I was much the same when I didn't have a sense of identity for who like my ancestry is. So like, because the thing is like, well, you know, I was born in Australia, so I'm a white Australian. Like, I have to understand my traditional roots back to the land. You know, so you got like the Kiwis and the Maoris in New Zealand. You know, you've got, you know, all your island cultures. Throughout Asia, you've got all your different sub-tribes. And it's the same in Asia where, you know, China sort of, you know, colonized and conquered a lot of it and took it out. And the same even in Japan. Japan had a very strong tribal culture up until the 1900s. It was called the shogunate, I'm pretty sure. I'm pretty sure that's the pronunciation. But basically, all the tribes and things sort of had a very, very strong traditional culture of, you know, integration and beliefs, and they shared the same identity in different ways, which is basically what any tribe is. Because you look at, like, you listen to anything on First Nations cultures and tribes, they were all they held the same beliefs, they just had different views on how sort of to go about it, different points of view and things like that. But they had very, very similar stories and, you know, from the land and things like that. So it's very interesting if you even just try to understand one subset of a culture and all the different tribes that make up that culture, which is crazy. Because I think this is where the future is going to go, because we have to get back to our roots of what connects us all together. Because all of our tribes came from the same area, Africa. You know, we all emigrated at different points to different areas. And those different areas shaped our beliefs and our, you know, cultures, and being separated and the different challenges, you know, that we faced. Like you gotta think, you know, when we talk about like going back to the ancient First Nations in Australia, you know, some of their mythology, and then you look at the prehistoric animals that were around. Imagine that if there was a 40, 50, 60 foot snake, you know, that created the serpent spirit and things like that, like that sort of belief, because you would have to believe that by seeing something that was that big, it would have to be able to sort of like engulf the world, like, you know, because our minds like can't really comprehend it. Like, you got to think, if you go throughout Europe and look at the cathedrals from the Middle Ages and things like that, some of these structures that were created over hundreds of years, and the magnitude, like, we just can't comprehend. It's to the same when we see like mountains, and like I really want to go and check out Ayers Rock. I understand why you can't go on Ayers Rock, but it sucks because it would just be such a magical place to experience. But so many people disrespected it, and you know, you got to give it to the First Nations in the area that, like, if you disrespect a sacred area, like, you can't do that. Like, we got to understand that, like, for us to truly care about nature and the environment around us, we have to make sacred nature and the environment around us, like the First Nations cultures did. Because if we don't, like, we can't save some ecosystem and destroy others. That's a stupid and illogical way to go about it. We have to really seek to protect all ecosystems simultaneously, and it's sort of like, if we can do that and we can learn to respect not only our cultures, all of the world, like everyone, and respect the differences, because the differences are what make us unique, because the differences are the stories of the different challenges and problems that were faced and how they struggled and overcame them. So you've got to understand these traditions from the past, the ancient traditions, are ways of overcoming challenges and problems, and sort of it's knowledge. It's one of the highest forms of knowledge, because you got to understand, like, without traditions we are nothing. Without traditions we are disconnected from our power, and our power is knowing who we are. Because you think about it, how amazing of a utopian life would it be if everyone cared about the environment? You can still build, you can still expand, you can still, we can still progress in life, but our primary focus is on doing it in a way that is sustainable with the environment. How amazing would the environment be if that all water sources were pure from pollutants and toxins? Now, that's not to say that, we should seek to do it fully, green. Like, the First Nations cultures understood you have to burn wood to make fire. We have to use the tools we can use to, live a comfortable life. But the key thing is that we don't use the tool, like, we don't seek comfort at the expense of our environment. So if we can do that, we can progress at a reasonable rate in a pristine, beautiful environment. And you think about that, like, if all of Australia had care for the land and worshipped the land in their own way and cared for the land in their own way, not at the expense of the land, then, you imagine how prosperous our agricultural sector would be, how prosperous our mineral sector would be, how prosperous our business and our tourism sector would be. And then you think about it, if we promoted, both cultures and showed the respect to the First Nations culture, and worked to mould the Australian culture around that, because we have to give respect to all those who cared for the land before us, so that we can be on the land. Because you think about it, like, what would Australia have been like if the First Nations cultures hadn't cared for it so meticulously? Potentially it could have been a desert. Potentially it could have been an arid wasteland. Or it could have been an overgrown jungle that was like the Amazon jungle and just impossible to navigate. So you got to think, like, when we, and this is a funny thing that I like to think about, and it's just funny to think about, but like, you got to think when we're traveling anywhere in the world, on any continent, like, we are traveling through an ancient ecosystem. Like if we're traveling through Australia, many of the paths I walk have been walked by people 60,000 years ago. Like, you gotta understand, like, and that's one of the things that is really crazy and makes it easy to sort of worship the land and the ecosystem and the environment, is understanding and just being able to get